I never thought I'd lose my father, Nicholas Thompson, at 65. He had always been the picture of health, strong, independent, and tough as nails. Even though he had the occasional aches and pains from years of working as a mechanic, I never once worried about his health. It wasn't until the call came that I realized how fragile life really is. My father, the man who had fixed countless cars, built things with his hands, and raised me on his own after my mother left when I was just a kid, was gone. Just like that. The stroke had taken him without warning, and I was left to pick up the pieces. It felt like the ground had been pulled out from under me, leaving nothing but a vast emptiness in its place. I stood there, holding the phone in my hand, hearing the words, but unable to truly process them. He was gone. I was suddenly without him, and all I could think was that I hadn't been ready for this. I spent most of my life with him in that small town, watching him run his auto repair shop. It was a humble life, nothing fancy, just the way he liked it. He didn't care about the attention or the spotlight. His shop, his tools, and his classic car collection were all that mattered. There was a certain peace in his routine. We didn't have much, but we had everything we needed. My mother had left when I was young, leaving me and my father to carve out a quiet, simple existence. I'd grown up helping him in the shop, learning about cars, and more importantly, learning about life. My father wasn't the most talkative man, but when he did speak, it was usually something worth hearing. He showed me how to work hard, how to fix things that were broken, and perhaps most importantly, how to take care of myself. Now with him gone, I was left to handle everything. The funeral arrangements, his estate, the house, things I'd never thought I'd have to take care of on my own. It wasn't supposed to be like this. But as I went through his things, sorting through memories, it wasn't the tasks I was focused on. It was the growing realization that I didn't really know as much about him as I thought I did. He'd kept so much to himself, never revealing much beyond the basics. He was always quiet about his personal life, and now as I went through his belongings, I realized how little I actually knew about the man who had raised me. It was during the reading of his will that things truly began to shift. Robert Hill, my father's lawyer, had known him for years, and when he handed me the envelope, I felt a sense of dread wash over me. I expected it to be straightforward. My father had never been one for complications, but when Robert spoke, his words left me uneasy. "Your father left you an unusual task," Robert said, his voice low, his expression serious. "He wanted you to find a man in this photograph and deliver this key to him. Only after you've done that can you access the rest of the inheritance." A task? A photograph? My mind raced. My father had never been one to leave cryptic instructions. Everything had always been simple, organized. Why would he leave me something so bizarre? I opened the envelope with shaking hands, and inside was a photograph of my father. It was old, probably from his late 40s, and in it he stood next to a man I didn't recognize. The background looked like an old barn, its wood weathered by time. The man beside my father was tall, with gray hair and a serious expression, almost as though he were a stranger rather than someone my father had been close to. And then there was the key, a small brass thing, tied to a fraying piece of string. "Why would he want me to find this man?" I muttered, looking up at Robert, feeling a sense of unease deep in my chest. Robert sighed, pushing his glasses up his nose. "I don't know the details, but your father made it very clear. Find this man. Deliver the key. That's the only way you'll be able to access the full inheritance." The words felt like they didn't belong in the room. It all seemed so out of place, so unlike the father I had known. And so, with that strange cryptic task hanging over me, I was left with more questions than answers. Who was this man? Why did my father want me to find him? What was this key for? And why did he leave me with this burden now that he was gone? The answers weren't in the will, and they certainly weren't in the house. So I set out on the only path I had left, follow the clues, and see where it led. The next day, I decided to start by researching the barn in the photograph. It seemed like the only real clue my father had left me, and I had no idea where else to turn. On the back of the photo, there was a faint sign, Old Wood Workshop. I ran a quick search online and found an address for a place by that name, located about 2 hours away from our small town. The business didn't have a website, but there was a phone number listed. I called, but after several attempts, no one picked up. I left a message, but I didn't feel hopeful. This whole thing felt strange, like I was walking into something that wasn't meant for me to find. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had no choice but to follow through with my father's last request. I spent the rest of the day in a haze of confusion. My mind kept wandering back to that photograph, the way my father stood with that stranger, the look of camaraderie between them. The more I thought about it, the more questions I had. Who was this man? And why hadn't my father ever spoken about him? Why had he kept this part of his life hidden from me for so long? It didn't make sense. That night, I barely slept. The idea of going to Oldwood Workshop gnawed at me, and by morning, I knew I had to see it for myself. I threw a bag together with the essentials, grabbed the photograph and key, and drove off without telling anyone. The road was quiet, the sky overcast, and the further I drove, the more unsettled I became. The towns blurred together as I passed, each one offering a glimpse of something I didn't fully understand. I kept thinking about my father, about how much he had kept from me. I thought I knew him. I thought I had everything figured out. But this task, this mystery, was a sharp reminder that I didn't know him as well as I thought. The drive took longer than I expected, and by the time I arrived in the small town where the workshop was supposed to be, the streets were empty. The air was damp, and a light drizzle began to fall as I turned down a narrow street, passing a bakery and a diner. Then, tucked between those two buildings, was the sign, Old Wood Workshop. It looked just as it did in the photograph, weathered and forgotten. The windows were covered with wooden planks, and the sign itself seemed like it hadn't been touched in years. I hesitated before entering. This wasn't what I'd expected. It looked abandoned, as though time had stopped in that small corner of the world. But I had to know. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The smell hit me immediately, old wood, dust, and the faint scent of something I couldn't quite place. The interior was dim, lit by the soft glow of light filtering through the cracks in the planks. Shelves lined the walls, filled with old wooden carvings, tools, and sculptures. It was clear that the shop had once been full of life, but now it felt like a place suspended in time. Behind the counter stood a man, probably in his late 60s, with a gray beard and glasses. He looked exactly like the man in the photograph. I swallowed hard, unsure of what to say. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice rough but warm. "I'm looking for someone," I said, my throat tight. "A man named William Hart. Do you know him?" The man's eyes widened when he heard the name, and his face paled. I could see the recognition in his eyes, and for a moment I thought he might say something more. But instead he just nodded slowly. "William?" he repeated, almost as if he couldn't believe it. I knew him well, but he's gone? "Yes," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "He passed away a few weeks ago. I have something for him. I need to deliver this key." The man's expression softened, and he motioned for me to follow him into a small office at the back of the shop. The room was cluttered with sketches and tools, remnants of a time when the workshop was thriving. We sat down at an old wooden desk, and he looked at the key in my hand, his face full of regret. "I'm Thomas," he said quietly, his voice cracking slightly. "I worked with your father for many years. We were partners in this workshop." "Partners?" I blinked, confused. My father never mentioned anyone by that name. Thomas sighed deeply, leaning back in his chair. "We were partners in business, yes, but it was more than that. Your father and I shared something he never told you about. For a long time, I was the one who helped him with more than just woodwork." I stared at him, unable to process what he was saying. "What do you mean?" Thomas looked pained. "Your father wasn't just a mechanic. He was an artist, a wood sculptor. He used the name J. Renwick. We made sculptures together, beautiful pieces that people wanted but that your father refused to sell under his real name. We kept it all a secret." My head spun. My father, the man I had always known as a simple mechanic, had been a renowned artist? The idea seemed impossible. This was a side of him I had never imagined. Thomas handed me a leather-bound portfolio, his hands trembling slightly. "This is his final piece," he said softly. "He wanted you to have it." I opened the portfolio and found a detailed sketch of a wooden sculpture. It was breathtaking, delicate yet strong, a piece that seemed to encapsulate everything about my father that I hadn't known. It was his final tribute, his legacy hidden away from the world. For the first time, I felt like I was seeing my father as he truly was, not just the quiet man I grew up with, but a man with a secret, a hidden life that I had never understood. The following weeks passed in a blur, and I couldn't seem to shake the feeling that I had just unlocked a door to a side of my father I would never fully understand. The more I learned, the more questions piled up. Why had he kept this secret from me? Why hadn't he ever shared his art, his passion for sculpting? My mind kept returning to that leather-bound portfolio, the final sculpture, and the words Thomas had spoken. He wanted you to have it. I couldn't make sense of it. My father, a simple mechanic who had raised me, had been hiding a second life as a renowned artist, and all this time I had been oblivious to it. I spent every free moment looking over the sketches and notes Thomas had handed me. They were filled with intricate designs and ideas for sculptures my father had created. Each page revealed his meticulous nature, his attention to detail, traits I had never seen in his everyday life. In those moments, as I pored over the sketches, I felt a deep connection to him, a bond that had eluded me for so long. Yet, at the same time, I felt an overwhelming sense of betrayal. How had he managed to keep such a huge part of himself hidden from me for all these years? And why had he chosen to live this life in secret? I had grown up believing my father was nothing more than the man I saw every day. Someone who spent his life fixing cars, sitting in his workshop, rarely talking about anything personal. There had always been a sense of distance between us, but I had chalked it up to his quiet nature. I never questioned it. But now, as I delved deeper into his secret life, I realized there had been an entire world hidden just beneath the surface, a world he had intentionally kept from me. It was hard to reconcile the father I knew with the artist behind the sculptures. I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep this hidden any longer. I had to share his art with the world. My father, though a deeply private man, had poured so much of himself into his sculptures, and they deserved to be seen. I couldn't let them fade into obscurity, lost to time like so many other secrets. The idea of publishing his work, of letting others see his genius, felt right. But it also made me anxious. What if people judged him? What if they didn't understand the art the way he intended? My father had been terrified of exposure, of being known, and now I was about to bring his secrets to light. But I knew it was the right thing to do. The first step was to figure out how to do it. I contacted art galleries, museums, and auction houses, hoping someone would understand the significance of my father's work. Everyone I spoke to was skeptical at first. The idea of publishing the work of a previously unknown artist under a pseudonym seemed risky, but after weeks of convincing and showing them the sketches and portfolio, I finally found a gallery in a nearby city that agreed to host an exhibition of my father's sculptures. They believed in the pieces, and more importantly, they believed in him. The day of the exhibition arrived, and I could hardly bring myself to go. My nerves were raw. What if the art didn't sell? What if people laughed at it? My father had never cared about the fame or fortune his work could have brought. But I cared. I cared about making sure his life's work wasn't forgotten. I cared about making sure that people knew the quiet mechanic from our small town wasn't just a man who fixed engines. He was an artist, a creator, someone whose work deserved recognition. Walking into that gallery, seeing the sculptures on display for the first time, I felt a strange sense of pride, mixed with a profound sadness. I could feel my father's presence in every piece. It was like he was right there with me, silently watching as the world finally took notice of him. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was seeing my father in a way I'd never imagined. He had always been the man who raised me, who gave me guidance and love, but now I was seeing him as a man with a dream, one that he had kept hidden because he was afraid of what the world would think. The evening was a blur. People were fascinated by the sculptures. Some were moved, some just curious, but everyone who saw them was touched by their raw emotion. I was approached by several buyers, some of whom had already made plans to display my father's work in their private collections. For the first time, I could feel the weight of his legacy, a legacy I never knew existed until it was too late to share it with him. When the exhibition ended, I sat in the empty gallery, alone, surrounded by my father's creations. I thought about the man I had known all my life, the man I thought I understood. In the quiet of the gallery, with the soft glow of the lights still shining on his art, I realized that my father wasn't just a man who worked with tools. He was a man who had lived a life full of depth and complexity. He had hidden it from me, but now I was finally able to see it, and I could only wish I had known him fully while he was still here. The truth, in all its rawness, was finally out in the open. And in that moment, I felt a sense of peace. My father's art had finally been seen, and he had, in a way, been set free. The weeks that followed the exhibition were a whirlwind. My father's sculptures were suddenly being talked about, admired, and sold for amounts I never imagined. The gallery's phones rang constantly with inquiries. A few of his pieces ended up in private collections, while others were put into displays at museums. It was strange, sitting in the quiet of my father's old shop, knowing that his work was now on display for the world to see. I'd often sit there, staring at the tools he used for decades, the same ones that had felt like an extension of him, and I'd wonder why he never shared this side of himself with me. I couldn't help but feel a mix of pride and regret. Pride because he had created something truly remarkable, but regret because I couldn't share this part of his life with him, not the way he would have wanted. The more his art gained recognition, the more I felt like I was learning who my father really was, in a way I never had before. My memories of him as a quiet, solitary man were slowly being replaced with the realization that he had lived a rich, complex life, one that I was only just beginning to understand. He had poured so much into his work, but he never wanted anyone to know about it. For the first time, I saw how much he had held back, how much he had hidden from me. I had always thought of him as simple, almost too modest for his own good. But the more I uncovered, the more I realized he wasn't just humble. He was terrified. Terrified of fame, of recognition, of being seen as something more than the mechanic he had chosen to be. He was a man who had feared judgment his entire life, and it had shaped everything he did, especially the life he had lived with me. It was late one evening, a few months after the exhibition, when I sat down at my desk and opened the portfolio again. I had been through it 100 times by then, but something about the pieces still felt incomplete. As I flipped through the pages, I came across a letter tucked between the sketches. I hadn't noticed it before. It was handwritten in my father's familiar, neat handwriting, small and tight, as if he had written it quickly. My hands trembled as I unfolded the paper. Dear Max, if you're reading this, then you've probably learned more about me than I ever wanted you to. I know you must be confused, angry, maybe even hurt that I never told you about the art I created. But I hope, by the time you read this, you'll understand why I kept it hidden. It wasn't because I didn't want you to know me, but because I was afraid. Afraid that you wouldn't understand me as anything other than your father, the mechanic. I wanted to be your father first, and the artist second. I was afraid that if you knew about my sculptures, it would change the way you saw me, maybe even the way you loved me. I wanted to be just a father, not a man who lived with regrets or aspirations that seemed impossible to explain. I never expected you to find this letter or the sculptures or anything that would force you to see me in a way I had never shown you. But now that you have, I can only hope that in your own way, you will forgive me. I didn't want to leave you with questions or worse, a burden. I wanted you to remember me as the father who showed you how to fix a car, how to make things work with your hands. The man I was when we were together every day. I don't want you to see me as some figure in the past, some distant artist you never knew. I want you to know me as I was with you. No more, no less. I'm sorry I never shared this part of my life with you. But please know, I loved you more than I ever loved anything else. And that's the truth. Yours always, Nicholas Thompson. The letter sat heavily in my hands, and for a long time, I couldn't move. I could feel my father's presence in every word. I had spent so much time trying to understand him, to understand why he had kept his secret life from me. But now, reading his words, I finally saw it. The fear, the love, the desire to protect me. He had never kept his art from me out of shame. He had kept it hidden out of love. He didn't want me to see him as anything other than the father I had always known. I felt tears prick my eyes, something I hadn't expected. I was angry, yes, but not at him. I was angry at the years we had lost, the time he had spent hiding from himself, and the fact that I hadn't known him fully. But deep down, I understood. He had been afraid of exposing the most vulnerable part of himself, and I had been too wrapped up in my own world to see it. My father had spent so much time trying to protect me from his own fears, when in reality, I would have understood. I would have embraced him, art and all, without hesitation. I closed the letter, the weight of it pressing against me. But as I sat there in my father's shop, surrounded by his tools and his legacy, I knew what I had to do next. I wasn't just going to share his art with the world. I was going to share his truth, his vulnerability. It was time for me to stop hiding too. Time for me to stop letting my father's fear shape the way I saw the world. He had passed on his legacy to me, and now it was up to me to honor it. The following months were a blur of activity, a whirlwind of decisions, and a growing sense of responsibility I hadn't been prepared for. The letter from my father, his truth, had settled in my chest like a heavy stone, but it had also sparked something in me. I finally understood why he had hidden himself, why he had kept his art locked away. And it wasn't because he was ashamed. He had protected me from a part of his life he thought I wouldn't understand, thinking that if he kept it from me, I'd love him the same. I had never understood it before, but now I saw it clearly. He loved me in the only way he knew how. By protecting me from his fears, his insecurities, he thought he was giving me the best of him. But I couldn't let it end there. He had given me his legacy, not just in his sculptures, but in his art, his vulnerability, and the truth of who he was. He had asked me to understand him, to accept him, and to share it with the world. And I was determined to honor that. I made the decision to take his last sculpture, the one he had entrusted to me, and not just show it to the world, but to share the full story. I reached out to several galleries and museums, but it wasn't until I met with Anna, a curator at a contemporary art museum in the city, that I felt like I had found the right place for my father's work. Anna was passionate, forward-thinking, and understood the importance of what I had. She didn't just see the art, she saw the story behind it. The secret life of an artist who had spent decades hiding his talent, his fears, and his love for his craft. As I prepared for the exhibition, every step felt surreal. The pieces, my father's pieces, were no longer just sketches in a portfolio. They were real now, alive in the world, being celebrated for what they truly were. It was a strange feeling, almost like bringing my father back into the world he had once been so afraid of. I felt both a sense of pride and an aching emptiness. This should have been a moment we shared, him and me, but instead it was just me now, carrying his story alone. The exhibition day arrived, and as I walked through the museum, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was standing in my father's shadow. The sculptures were displayed with care, each piece telling a story of strength, fragility, beauty, and pain. People stood in front of the pieces, some nodding in appreciation, others taking pictures or discussing the details with one another. And I stood there, in the background, just watching, wondering if my father had ever imagined this moment. Had he ever imagined that his work would be seen by the world? Or had he only ever been afraid of rejection? The opening night was bustling with people, critics, artists, art lovers, and collectors, all gathered around, admiring the works of an artist they had never heard of before. I was introduced to a few people who had bought my father's pieces, and each time I heard someone speak of them, I felt an overwhelming surge of emotions. The admiration was real, but it felt bittersweet. The man they admired was the man I had always known, yet the man they admired had been a mystery to me until now. By the end of the night, after the last of the guests had left, I found myself standing alone in front of his final sculpture, the one he had gifted me. The room was quiet, the lights dim, and I could hear the hum of the city outside through the windows. It was just me and my father's work. A sense of peace washed over me. For the first time, I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't upset that he had kept this part of himself from me. Instead, I understood. He had feared the world and feared what being truly seen could mean. But in doing so, he had left me the chance to give him the final tribute he had always been too afraid to claim. I wasn't just sharing his art with the world. I was sharing his truth. And in doing that, I was finally honoring the man I had known and the man I had just discovered. The world would never know him the way I had, but through his art, they would know him for what he truly was. Not just a mechanic, but a visionary, a creator. And that in itself felt like the greatest gift he could have ever given me. As I stood there, in the quiet of the gallery, I could almost feel him there beside me. I wanted to say so many things, but all I could do was smile, knowing I had done right by him. His legacy was finally out there, and it would live on long after I was gone. And that thought, that realization, gave me the kind of peace I had been searching for all along. The months following the exhibition felt like a new chapter in my life, one that was both incredibly fulfilling and deeply bittersweet. The success of the show was undeniable. My father's work was recognized by critics and collectors, celebrated for its craftsmanship and emotional depth. I could see the legacy he had left behind beginning to take shape in the eyes of others. But for me, the journey was far from over. The more I reflected on the past, the more I realized how much of my father I had never truly known. It was as if I had only scratched the surface of the man who had spent his life shielding himself from the world. In the quiet moments, when I was alone with my thoughts, I often found myself at the workshop, the very space where he had worked for years. It felt empty without him, yet it also felt like the one place where his spirit lingered. I would run my fingers over the tools he had left behind, imagining his hands on them, shaping the wood, carving his dreams into reality. The thought of him working here, in solitude, with his fears and his art, made my heart ache. He had never allowed anyone to see the man behind the work, not even me, his only child. The more I worked with the gallery to prepare his art for auction and private collections, the more I felt his absence in the smallest details. The auction houses were interested in more of his work, and the pieces were going for far more than I ever imagined. Yet, as his art began to sell, something inside me struggled to let go. It wasn't the money, it was the feeling that my father had been hiding for so long, and now, in death, he was being celebrated for it. It felt like a part of him was slipping through my fingers, slipping into the hands of strangers who would never understand the depth of his struggle. One afternoon, I received a call from Anna, the curator at the museum where my father's exhibition had been held. She wanted to meet with me in person. I wasn't sure what to expect, but when we sat down, I could tell that something was different. She handed me a folder, and inside, I found a letter from the gallery, a letter that stopped me in my tracks. It was from a private buyer, someone who had recently acquired one of my father's sculptures. The buyer had requested an additional meeting. They wanted to meet with me specifically. The letter didn't say much more than that, but I could sense that something important was about to unfold. After several days of planning, I met the buyer. The meeting was set at a small, private gallery in the city. When I walked into the room, I was greeted by a man in his late 40s, dressed in a sharp suit. He was tall, with a serious look on his face. His presence was imposing, and yet there was something strangely familiar about him. "Mr. Thompson," he said, extending a hand, "I'm glad you could make it. Please, have a seat." I sat across from him, unsure of what to say. He opened the folder he had on the table and slid a piece of paper toward me. It was a copy of a photograph I hadn't seen in years. It was a photo of my father, much younger, standing in front of a familiar-looking barn, with the same man from the earlier photograph, William Hart. The man in front of me was staring at the picture with an intensity I didn't quite understand. Finally, he spoke. "My name is Richard Evans," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I knew your father, but I knew him by another name, J. Renwick." My heart skipped a beat. The name, the pseudonym my father had used for all those years, felt like a punch to my chest. Richard continued, his eyes never leaving the photo. "Your father and I were more than just collaborators. We were partners in many ways. I was the one who encouraged him to keep creating, to keep hiding his true self. I pushed him into it, and in many ways, I regret it. But he was a man of integrity, and his work was more than just art. It was a message. And I know that now, looking at it, I should have understood. But it's too late for that." I sat there, stunned, trying to process what I was hearing. Richard Evans was the man behind much of my father's decision to keep his work hidden. He had been part of the reason my father had lived in secrecy for so long, pushing him toward a life of artistic anonymity. It was as though all the pieces were finally coming together. "I'm sorry," Richard said, his voice softer now. "I didn't know how to make amends for the damage I caused, but I've been trying. That's why I've come to you. I want you to know the truth about your father. He wasn't just a mechanic. He wasn't just a man who fixed cars. He was a man with a vision, with the ability to change the way people thought about art. And I was wrong to let him hide." I sat in silence, letting his words sink in. It wasn't just about the art. It was about the man my father had been, the silent architect of his own life. He had been a prisoner of his own fear for so long, afraid of what the world would think of him if they knew the truth. And now, years after his death, I was finally uncovering the full extent of his life. After Richard left, I sat in that gallery for a long time, reflecting on everything I had learned. My father had lived with a secret for so long, but in the end, he had passed it on to me, not just his art, but the legacy of a life spent in hiding. I had always thought I was the one who had to figure out who my father was. But in truth, it had been him all along. He had been hiding, just waiting for someone to understand him fully. And now, it was my turn to let the world see him as he truly was. The burden had shifted to me, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid. The days following my meeting with Richard Evans felt like a blur of reflection and realization. I had always thought I understood my father, his quiet demeanor, his passion for mechanics, the way he built his life around his work and his family. But now, with each passing day, I was uncovering more and more layers to the man I had called Dad. He had been a complex figure, full of contradictions, and I was only beginning to grasp the full extent of his journey. The more I thought about Richard's words, the more they resonated with me. My father wasn't just the man who had raised me, taught me how to change a tire, or showed me the value of a hard day's work. He was also a man of vision, a man who had created art not for fame or fortune, but because it was in his soul to do so. He had created masterpieces in secret, away from the eyes of the world, and all I had known was the mechanic he had chosen to be. But as I sat there, in the stillness of the workshop, the place where it all began, I realized that my father had never really chosen to be just one thing. He had never been just a mechanic. He had been a creator, a man who had lived with one foot in the world of reality and the other in a world of artistic expression. And for so long, he had hidden that part of himself because he was afraid that if the world saw the artist within him, it would change how people viewed him, including me. I had spent so much of my life trying to make sense of him, but the truth was, I had never really known him at all, not the way I thought I did. He had kept his art hidden from me, from the world, because he was afraid of rejection, afraid of being judged for wanting more than just the life of a mechanic. And now, as his art was being seen and celebrated, I could finally see him for who he truly was. The exhibition had been a turning point. I had shown the world my father's work, but it had also been a turning point for me. It had forced me to confront my own feelings about my father and the secrets he had kept from me. It wasn't just about the sculptures, the art, or the recognition. It was about understanding the man behind the work, the vulnerable, fearful, brilliant man who had lived with insecurities and fears just like everyone else. I wasn't just revealing his art to the world. I was revealing him. And in doing that, I was allowing myself to finally understand him. But understanding wasn't enough. I realized I had to take the next step, to honor him fully, to live out the legacy he had unknowingly left behind. That's when I decided to take the final step. I had already shared his work, and now it was time for me to share more. His story. I began writing. I started with the photographs, the sketches, and the notes he had left behind. I compiled everything. Every piece of writing, every memory, every sketch, and I began to craft something bigger than just a show or an exhibition. I was going to write the story of his life, the one he had never shared with me, the one I had uncovered in bits and pieces. As I wrote, I began to understand my father on a deeper level than I ever had. The pages of his life started to fill in, and I could feel the weight of what he had carried all these years. The fear of exposure, the shame he had felt for wanting more than the life of a mechanic, and the loneliness that had come with keeping such a monumental part of himself hidden. But through it all, he had never stopped loving me. In his own way, he had protected me from the truth because he thought it would hurt me. But in reality, it was only by understanding his truth that I could truly appreciate the man he had been. The day I finished writing, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. It was as if I had finally given my father the voice he had never allowed himself to have. And in doing so, I had given myself the chance to heal, to let go of the anger, the confusion, and the sense of loss I had carried for so long. My father was no longer a mystery to me. I knew him now, in a way I never had before. I published the story a few months later, alongside his art in a limited edition book. It was more than just a tribute to his work. It was a tribute to him, the man behind the art, the man who had been too afraid to live fully, but who had given me everything he could, his love, his lessons, and his art. The response was overwhelming. People who had never known him now understood him. They saw the depth of his soul, his struggles, and his brilliance. For the first time, I felt like I had done right by him. I had given him the recognition he had always feared, but also the recognition he had deserved. And in doing so, I had found my own peace. As I stood in front of his sculpture one last time, I realized that his story was no longer just mine to carry. It was the world's now. And for the first time, I felt like I had truly understood my father. Not the mechanic, not the artist, but the man who had lived with both identities, who had lived them in tandem, quietly, secretly, but with a depth I would never have imagined. And in that quiet realization, I found the closure I had been seeking all along. Life has a way of hiding the most important truths from us, often out of fear or a desire to protect others. My father, for example, spent years hiding his true passion for art, afraid of how the world would perceive him. It wasn't until after his death that I discovered the depth of his life, his struggles, his artistry, and the legacy he had been too scared to share. The advice I'd offer is this: don't live in fear of judgment or rejection. Embrace who you truly are, even if it feels uncomfortable. The world may not always understand you, but being authentic will bring peace, even if it's difficult to embrace at first. Don't let the weight of secrets or fears hold you back from fully living and sharing the parts of yourself that are meaningful. Be open with those you love, and don't be afraid to show your vulnerabilities. You might be surprised at how much understanding and connection can come from sharing your true self. And finally, remember that your legacy isn't just in what you accomplish, but in how you live openly and authentically, inspiring others to do the same.